Welcome and thank you for joining today's conference, Fiscal Year 2020-2021 RCPP Classic National Funding Opportunity. Before we begin, please ensure you've opened the chat panel by using the associated icon located at the bottom of your screen. You may submit questions via the chat, and be sure to send questions to all panelists. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. There is a poll open as well, and we would appreciate you taking the time to answer the question. All audio lines have been muted to reduce background noise. And as a reminder, this conference is being recorded. And with that, I'll turn the call over to Kari Cohen, Branch Chief at NRCS. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome to all of our potential applicants and partners. This is the webinar where we're going to go over our second RCPP Classic funding announcement following passage of the 2018 Farm Bill. If you've been following us, we've announced the first set of awards this past April, and that was for 48 projects at just over $200 million. Lucky for you, this time around we've got up to $360 million available through this funding announcement. As we combine 2 years of funding, we're trying to catch up to the appropriate program cycle. So there's really no better time to apply, and I'm so happy that so many of you have joined today's webinar. As our host said, please don't be shy about typing questions into the chat box. Once I get through the slides today, we'll get through as many questions as possible. And our intent is to post a FAQ document to the RCPP website with all of your questions and our answers just as soon as possible after the webinar. So my name is Kari Cohen. I'm the Project Branch Chief here at NRCS. So it's my team that has national responsibility for the RCPP program. Very importantly, we rely on our colleagues in our state offices to actually manage the projects and agreements at the state level. And we'll talk about the importance of our state coordinators here in just a few minutes. Okay, we'll jump into our slides. Just to show you kind of the things we're going to go through today, my intent is to kind of give a high-level overview of the program and this funding announcement without going into great detail. Certainly encourage anyone applying to the program to pore over the funding announcement. There's all sorts of details in there that are really critical as you develop your proposals in the RCPP portal. So let's start at the top with a question about, what is RCPP in a nutshell? And really, what this program is about is partnerships and NRCS co-investing in targeted, innovative natural resource solutions. Two quick basics about the program. RCPP was first authorized in the 2014 Farm Bill, and as I mentioned, it was reauthorized in the 2018 Farm Bill. The 2018 Farm Bill language was substantially and is substantially different from the 2014 Farm Bill. So if you're managing an existing RCPP program projects under the 2014 Farm Bill, we administer the new projects in a very different way. And effectively what RCPP does is it promotes coordination of conservation activities with partners. Very important that those partners are bringing value-added contributions to these projects. So it's effectively, what we're doing here is combining our forces on these projects so that the sum of our contributions within RCS and our partners are more than what any one of us could do alone. These are the 4 principles of RCPP. You'll see them throughout the funding announcement, most notably in the evaluation criteria. And the evaluation criteria are based on these 4 principles. First off, we're looking for projects that have a compelling impact, that are telling a good natural resource story, that are trying to solve natural resource solutions. Secondly is partner contributions. I just mentioned we're looking for projects and partners that are able to bring capacities and skills and funding to the table to leverage the NRCS investment. Innovation is really important. Innovation in RCPP can be brought to the table in many different ways, whether it's through innovative targeting approaches, innovative practices, innovative ways to combine different RCPP activities on the ground. But innovation is a really key principle of RCPP. And finally, partnership and project management is really important. As we found through the history of RCPP, lead partners and the broader partnerships that have the capacity and the capability to manage federal projects of this size and this complexity is really a key part of the program. And so we'll be looking very closely at the project management capabilities of the partnership. And we'll be referencing elements of these principles throughout the webinar today. Just wanted to note that since the 2018 Farm Bill, RCPP now comes in 3 different flavors. We're talking today about RCPP Classic, which is the traditional program, which has been running since the 2014 Farm Bill. We also have RCPP renewals opportunities. We've had 2 of those so far under the 2018 Farm Bill, through which we can approve streamlined renewal of successful projects. We just closed up the FY21 renewal process. We also have an interesting component called alternative funding arrangements. That's a separate competition for projects that are almost entirely partner-led, where partners have the responsibility for both the technical and financial assistance of getting conservation on the ground with producers. We're looking for progressive conservation approaches and infrastructure projects under the AFAs. And we are just about to announce in September the very first AFA awards under the 2018 Farm Bill. And as I'll mention later, the next AFA funding announcement will be coming out later this calendar year. But today we're going to focus on the RCPP Classic component. I do want to mention the RCPP final rule. The 2018 Farm Bill required MRCS to develop a regulation for RCPP for the first time. Some of you may have commented to the interim final rule that came out earlier this winter. We have those comments and are digesting and analyzing them. The final rule is scheduled for release before December 31st of this year. What the drafts that we have in play right now for the final rule are consistent with information in this funding announcement. Want to make sure you're aware of that. And also that any agreements associated with this announcement won't be signed until the final rule is published, which is fine because, as you'll note, this does not close until November 4th, and we'll have obviously some evaluation and analysis time on the NRCS side, so we will not be signing any agreements associated with these projects and proposals until 2021. So a quick overview of the funding announcement. As I mentioned, it makes available up to $360 million combining funds from 2 fiscal years. The project maximum, just like last time around, is $10 million, and we funded 1 or 2 projects at that level when we announced the April awards. And the minimum is $250,000. The proposal period is open for 90 days. We wanted to make sure that folks in these challenging times of working remotely have the ability and the time to pull together these partnerships. The proposals are due on November 4th by 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. Proposals for RCPP, even though you may have found the funding announcement on grants.gov, we do not accept proposals through grants.gov. Everything has to be submitted through the RCPP portal. And I will note here in the next slide that we have a special webinar just to instruct folks how to navigate the portal. And that's going to be September 10th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. If you're interested in participating, the details are on the How to Apply page on the National RCPP website. Just want to encourage folks, as we do in the funding announcement, if you have never gotten authorization to enter the RCPP portal, it does take a little bit of time. You need to have what we call an EOS, and so you need to apply for that and then apply for the portal to be able to get into the portal. And so just make sure you leave plenty of time to get those permissions. Okay, let's dive into the funding announcement. If you're familiar with RCPP, you'll know that we have 2 funding pools, and every year we have to spend half of our funding in each of the pools. The first funding pool is the Critical Conservation Area pool. And so projects that are applying to the CCA pool have to take place within the boundaries of a CCA. You'll see the CCA map here. We did make some adjustments to the CCAs this year for the first time since the program started. You'll see the big brown blob out in the west coast here. We combined the California Bay Delta CCA with the Columbia River Basin CCA, drawing in the Puget Sound Basin and the Klamath Basin. So that's our new Western Waters CCA. And that allowed us to add a CCA in the Northeast, which is our Northeast Forest and Waters CCA, and you can see it outlined there in lavender. The rest of the CCAs have been maintained since the 2015 competition. The other half of our funding is going to be spent in what we call the state multi-state pool. So these can be projects anywhere in the country, including, of course, our Pacific Islands and the Caribbean. And these projects can propose activities in a single state, as its name implies, or in multiple states. But just note that we are giving priority consideration to projects that propose activities in a reasonable number of states. We have found that projects that are looking to do work in 8 to 10 states or something like that, even anything above 5, can be really challenging from a logistical standpoint. And so, we did fund projects last time around. I think the most that states that we funded was a project in 3 states, possibly 4. So please keep that in mind as you're thinking about your project. And through the state multi-state pool, we certainly anticipate making both small and large awards through this funding pool. This is the list straight out of the RCPP statute of the partners that are eligible for RCPP. So all the partners that are submitting as a lead partner have to qualify as one of these types of entities. You'll notice that individuals are not eligible to apply. Then beyond the lead partner, and again, the lead partner is the entity that's going to be responsible for submitting the proposal, that's going to be responsible for the deliverables in the proposal and for delivering the partner contributions. We can also have contributing partners, and a contributing partner is any individual or entity that provides project contributions. So note that those folks providing partner contributions do not have to be an entity on this list. It can be an individual. It could be an engineering firm, for example, which would not qualify under this list. So the list of folks, individuals, entities that can be contributing partners is broader than the list of eligible lead partners. And as once you get into our RCPP portal and start developing your proposal, you'll note that we ask for the names of contributing partners and the extent of their contributions and their roles in the project. Land eligibility is a very important concept. The RCPP statute actually makes clear that the only lands eligible for RCPP projects are agricultural lands and non-industrial private forest lands, plus associated lands. And you'll see some definitions associated with that statement in the funding announcement. We always get a lot of questions about public lands, and just want to note that we tried to clarify this time around in the funding announcement that public lands may be eligible for RCPP funding in 2 specific instances. First is when a project is proposing a public work structure and they'd like to construct it on public land, maybe it's local land, maybe it's state-owned land, but the benefits would accrue to private ag land. Then it's possible that we would accept that sort of arrangement. And secondly, as a producer who has demonstrated control of a patchwork of private and public lands, we see this out west often, for example, and they seek to apply a conservation activity across the full acreage. Well, then in that case, it's quite possible that we would allow public lands to be brought into the RCPP fold. Again, there's more details on this land eligibility issue in the funding announcement. I encourage you to read it very carefully. Okay, I'm going to take a quick sip of water. So the big question is, what actually happens in these projects? Well, the answer are conservation activities. RCPP is all about getting conservation on the ground, working with agricultural producers, private forest landowners, ranchers. And effectively, we have 5 activity types in RCPP, and lead partners may propose any combination of these in a project. The first is land management. Then we have land rental authority, which is unique to RCPP for NRCS. There's two types of easements that we allow under RCPP, both U.S.-held easements and entity-held easements. And then we have those public works activities that I mentioned just a bit ago. I'm going to walk through all these in very little detail, just to give you a sense for what these activity types are about. Land management activities are very familiar to those of you who are familiar with our EQIP or CSP program. What this consists of are contracts between NRCS and a producer or landowner, and they're going to follow an EQIP or CSP-like model. Even though we are no longer managing RCPP through what we call the covered programs like EQIP and CSP, to ensure that, fiscal and scientific integrity, we're pretty much following an EQIP and CSP-like model for these land management activities for RCPP. Any producer or landowner participating in an RCPP project in a land management contract, they must meet all of these, critical compliance elements, including adjusted gross income, highly erodible land, and wetlands conservation provisions, similar to our other conservation programs at NRCS. Funding for land management activities basically goes to implement conservation practices that NRCS has had for many, many, many years, and enhancements similar to those that we fund through our CSP program. And application and conservation planning activities under these land management contracts follow our standard NRCS processes. Now, there are flexibilities involved because this is RCPP, and we'll get to what some of those are here in just a little bit. For land rentals, again, this is a unique authority here for NRCS. The covered program under which we have this authority is the Conservation Reserve Program, which is managed by our sister agency, the Farm Service Agency. And again, these are contracts between NRCS and an eligible producer, and they are expected to be used in an RCPP context for short-term targeted land rentals. We are not looking necessarily to pursue long-term 10-year-plus land rentals like we do in the CRP program, largely because, RCPP is a 5-year project, generally speaking. We want to keep these land rentals for short-term targeted purposes. So just like for land management, application, ranking, and contracting will follow standard processes, and NRCS has developed land rental rates for this activity, which, again, there's some flexibility around those rental rates that can be negotiated. Okay. For those of you familiar with U.S. held easements, we have the Wetland Reserve Program here at Wetland Reserve Easements Program here at NRCS, where we have U.S. held easements. This is somewhat similar, except that our easements under RCPP are available for any eligible land use. So it can be for ag lands, forest lands, associated wetlands and riparian areas. So that's kind of unique to RCPP. This is effectively an easement between NRCS and the landowner. And just like for the other elements, landowners must meet both producer and land eligibility requirements of the program. There is the possibility for partner-led contracting for closing services and also for easement monitoring if our partners are interested in those elements. For U.S. held easements, we have a unique model for RCPP. We have what we call restriction-based template deeds. And you'll see here down below that if the partners are interested in having our easements with landowners be very restrictive, in which the U.S. is holding effectively all the land rights, similar to our WRE program, then NRCS will pay up to 100% of the easement value. If it's looking at a moderate restriction, similar to a WRE with reserved grazing rights, or HFRP, which is the Healthy Forest Reserve Program, where there can be continued timbering operations, then we'll pay up to 75% of the easement value. If it's a least restrictive easement deed, similar to our ALE program, where, for example, the cropland easement, where a farmer is going to continue cropping the land, then we'll pay up to 50% of the easement value. Now, partner contributions may be used to complement this funding, so if it's a least restrictive easement, we'll only pay up to 50%. Partners are welcome to toss in cash to make these easements more attractive to landowners. The other type of easement that we have available in RCPP are entity-held easements, where, we have a partner that is actually going to hold the easement instead of the United States. Again, just like for the U.S. held easements, these are available for any eligible land use, ag land, forest land, et cetera. The producer, again, engaging in these easements or accepting these easements has to meet those producer and land eligibility requirements of the program that are in the funding announcement. And for entity-held easements, NRCS will pay up to 50% of the easement value with a U.S. right of enforcement. And we also have something unique in RCPP. We actually allow entities to enter into easements with landowners without a U.S. right of enforcement. But if folks are interested in that, NRCS will just pay up to 25% of the easement value. And for these entity-held easements, the value is determined by a before and after appraisal of the offered acres. We do have available on the RCPP How to Apply page the minimum deed terms associated with these entity-held easements. I encourage you to look at those. We just posted them last week. And so any entity-held easements will have to incorporate those minimum deed terms in the terms of the easement deed. For these entity-held easements, we're expecting to follow closing procedures that are similar to our ACEP ALE program, for those of you familiar with that. And we do require match for entity-held easements. So if we're going to pay, for example, up to 50% of the value of the easement, the other 50% has to come from somewhere. And that somewhere can be any combination of cash and landowner donation. And all of this is detailed, again, in the funding announcement, particularly for these easement information. This easement information is back in the appendix, the first appendix, so I encourage you to read that information very carefully. Okay, Public Works and Watershed Projects. Again, if you're familiar with our PL 566 program here at NRCS, where we have built many watershed structures over the, many decades, this element of RCPP works somewhat similarly to PL 566, although it's designed to have a little bit of flexibility as well. These public works structures are going to be built under a supplemental agreement between NRCS and an eligible partner. Planning and design may be a component of the project, but we really want partners to be aware of the time constraints of RCPP projects. These public works structures can take quite some time, particularly if we're starting at ground zero, where we have to do planning and design and construction. And remember that these are 5-year projects, generally speaking. So, folks need to just be cognizant of the time constraints here when we're thinking about a watershed project in RCPP. The Plan and Design Approval Authority is largely consistent with our PL 566 model, need to be compliant with NEPA and principles, responsibilities, and guidelines for federal water infrastructure projects. So folks need to make sure that they're aware of that. And then a little bit of detail is required in the RCPP proposal for these public works activities. We want to be aware up front of the timing and milestones for these projects so that we are fully confident that these projects be carried out within the time frame of an RCPP agreement. Again, much more detail on this information in the funding announcement. So what are lead partners getting out of an RCPP project? Why would a lead partner want to engage in RCPP? It's a great question, because largely most of the funding for an RCPP project is actually going to be transmitted from NRCS directly to a producer or a landowner. Well, the great thing about RCPP is that it can complement what an entity or a lead partner is trying to do in any geographic area or natural resource concern. So effectively, what the lead partner is asking us to do is to target NRCS funding to a specific place for a specific natural resource issue. So what types of input can a lead partner have? Certainly the geographic area. You can say we want to work in this watershed, we want to work in this state or in this collection of states. The resource concerns available. Of course, in the CCAs, you have to be working on the priority resource concern for that CCA, but you can say we want to work on water quality. We want to work on wildlife habitat in this given geographic area. You can recommend the types of land uses that this project should work on. So it could be grazing land, it could be cropland, it could be forest land, it could be wetlands, for example. You can also have influence over the ranking process. So when we have funding available for producers to apply for, you can help us develop the ranking information and questions that can prioritize different types of applications. And then partners can also bring to NRCS a bundle of applications. So if you have a project set up and you go out and do outreach and you say, we want these 10 producers to participate in our project, NRCS can actually give priority to that bundle of applications. So this is just a quick snapshot, and I'm not going to go through all of these, of the potential flexibilities and the different activity types that I just went through. I'll give one example in land management because that is the majority of the activity types that we have, generally speaking, when we get RCPP proposals in. If you or someone wants to do a wildlife habitat project, let's just pick up the state of Minnesota, for example, and they want to work in southeastern Minnesota, and they want to work, again, on wildlife habitat, they could say, we want to focus on these 10 conservation practices because we're working to try to improve habitat for this, 5 bird species. And these are the types of practices that we know help those bird species. Well, we can try to focus the project to just address those 10 conservation practices, and we could kind of target the ranking process to prioritize those applications that are addressing those practices. We could also, take a look at the payment rates associated with those practices, and deviate potentially or amend the payment scenarios that exist for those practices to either pay a little bit more than maybe under EQIP or something like that. Anyway, there's flexibility there. And then also there's the potential to look at interim practice standards for projects as well. And there's more information on interim practice standards in the funding announcement. I won't get into the details here today. Anyway, there's different flexibilities and places where lead partners can have input into our RCPP project. Okay, I'm going to take another drink of water. Talk a little bit about how RCPP funding works. So every partner, lead partner with a proposal is going to make an overall funding request. And let's say for a round number that you request $10 million. Every RCPP project is effectively made up of 2 types of funding. One is financial assistance, and you'll see here that our definition of that is literally getting conservation on the ground using RCPP contracts, easements, supplemental agreements. And our general rule is that 70% of every project has to go for this financial assistance. And so if you've got a $10 million project, $7 million of the funding has to go for on-the-ground conservation. The other 30% is for technical assistance, which are all those activities that are required to help get the conservation on the ground. And we detail all this information in the funding announcement. We break down this 30% of technical assistance into what we call enhancement TA. And enhancement TA are activities that the lead partner or other partners through the lead partner can get reimbursed for that basically enhance the success of the project. So things like project management, filling out NRCS reports, wrangling the partnership, doing producer outreach, evaluating the outcomes of a project, and so on and so forth. Partners can request up to 7% of the overall funding for enhancement TA. The remainder of the TA is what we call implementation technical assistance. That's the 23% that's remained. 5% of that, again, this is 5% of the overall project request, is going to be retained by NRCS no matter what. We have lots of project management responsibilities. We have to do HEL and wetlands compliance checks and AGI compliance and these sorts of activities. So we're going to keep 5% of the funding for our TA. The other 18% is negotiated. NRCS can maintain it entirely to help producers implement conservation activities on their land. If a partner has the capability or capacity or would like to use a third party that has the capability and capacity to do on-the-ground conservation TA with producers, then it's possible that NRCS can provide some of that 18% to a partner or a third party. So very important to understand how this funding works for NRCS and for RCPP. I've just walked through the enhancement TA, but just to clarify again, partners may request this enhancement TA. On page 13 of the funding announcement, you'll see all the list of eligible enhancement TA activities, and here are some that I mentioned earlier. So, for example, if you're requesting a $2 million project, what 7% equates to is $140,000 in enhancement TA that the lead partner or partners could get. This is subject to negotiation, so just because the partner or lead partner puts a figure in the proposal, it is still subject to negotiation and isn't finalized until the agreement is developed. Partners must identify in your proposal how you plan to value your enhancement TA cost. So if you say you're going to spend $100,000 on project management, we want to know what is that going to look like. Is that going to be based on salary, personnel costs? What do those personnel costs look like? We want to see some indication to have some understanding that your cost estimates are credible and defensible. Again, the implementation TA, I mentioned the 5% that's retained by NRCS and the 18% that is retained by NRCS unless requested and justified by partners and approved by us. And again, there on page 13 of the funding announcement, you'll see a table that has typical implementation TA activities and TA rates that the partners intend to charge NRCS or charge the project, or if there's third parties involved, they must be competitive with NRCS rates, and all that can be negotiated once the project gets started. Just a note on administrative costs, the 2018 Farm Bill statute actually prohibits NRCS from paying administrative costs associated with our project for RCPP. Basically, these administrative costs for us mean kind of overhead or indirect costs. Some of you may be familiar with these terms. So we can't pay for overhead or indirect costs as part of an RCPP project. However, unrecovered administrative costs may be counted as partner contributions, and details on how to value those are in the funding announcement. They're on page 16, so I encourage you to take a look at that. Let's talk through some details about partner contributions. I mentioned very early on that this is a very important concept for RCPP. Whenever we talk to Secretary Perdue about RCPP, he's always keenly interested in how partners are coming to the table and living up to the contributions that they committed to these projects. Our stated goal of contributions is that the partner contributions at least equal the NRCS investments. We're looking for partner contributions that are value added, that really bring value to these projects, that are substantive, elevating, amplifying. We use all of these words. We can look at proposed contributions and tell pretty quickly whether they're value added and substantive. While it is allowed for partners to request unrecovered indirect costs as partner contributions, they're not necessarily equitable when you're looking at something like cash contributions to put more conservation practices on the ground. So just be aware that we're looking closely at the qualitative and the quality of partner contributions and not just the quantity. The lead partner assumes full responsibility for delivering contributions, even if contributions are coming from lots of different partners. And the 2018 statute makes a distinction between cash and in-kind, and so we ask you in the proposal to make that distinction as well. Very key point is that non-USDA federal contributions are allowed if they're related to the project objectives and being spent in the same geographic area on the same resource concerns. So, for example, EPA funding, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service funding, USGS funding. Again, if they're supportive of the project objectives and being spent in the same area during the life of the project, then there's potential there that federal funding could count as contribution. Again, the portal application will require you to justify the value of your contributions, so very important that partners pay attention to that. The table on page 13 of the funding announcement includes potential contribution activities, and you'll see how that's linked to the proposal when you get into the portal. And very important, any contributions that are proposed by partners that are not the lead partner must be supported by a commitment letter. We always try to match up the partner contributions with those commitment letters and make sure the totals match. So it's really critical that all the partners that are providing financial contributions submit commitment letters into the portal. Okay, let me talk a little bit about outcomes. Very important concept in the 2018 Farm Bill. So if you look at what an RCPP project does and what happens in an RCPP project, all the way out on the left side of the slide, you'll see that there's personnel and funding and training that might go into a project. There's planning that may go in either at the area-wide or farm scale. Then we might enter, the partners and NRCS may enter into RCPP contracts and easements with producers and landowners to do something on the ground. And that something is in this circle. We can apply conservation practices, we can put easements on the ground, we can do public work structures. Historically, if you look at the 2014 Farm Bill, we always required our existing projects to report on these outputs. How many conservation practices are on the ground? How many acres were put on the ground? How many easements under this project? And those are good outputs to measure. However, for all these new projects under the 2018 Farm Bill, we're requiring them all to report on at least the environmental outcomes of a project. And again, an outcome is taking things a step further and trying to figure out, okay, we put these things on the ground. Well, what is the actual environmental impact or effect of doing those things? So what is the water quality outcome or impact or improvements? How much has the wildlife habitat been improved? How many more birds are out there? How much more water is available if it's a water quantity project? These are the environmental outcomes that we're asking every project to report on. Optional are economic outcomes and social outcomes. We saw lots of projects coming through the first round of RCPP Classic that are actually going to be, have partners that are out there trying to figure out the economic outcomes and how are producers, economic livelihoods better or hopefully not worse as a result of conservation practices or easements that they engaged in through RCPP. So outcomes, very important concept, and all of our projects have to do this. Again, environmental outcomes are required, economic and social outcomes are optional. We have an outcomes guidance document on the How to Apply page. We certainly encourage everybody to review that very carefully to understand how we're approaching outcomes. If your project is selected for an award, we've got a little bit of an outcomes team here at NRCS that will work with awardees to develop a standardized data collection and outcomes plan that will be a part of the RCPP agreement. Okay, let me talk a little bit about how proposals are reviewed, just so folks we have complete transparency here. So all of our RCPP Classic proposals are reviewed and evaluated at the state level by a team of NRCS employees. Obviously, if there's a multi-state project, there's coordination that's required among the states that are involved. And all the reviews are based on the evaluation criteria that are included in the funding announcement. So whether it's Minnesota or Hawaii or Puerto Rico or Maine that's doing the evaluation, they're all using the same evaluation criteria. So then once we get all the state reviews and the rankings, they're submitted here to NHQ, national headquarters, where we do a bunch of analysis. We want to ensure that there's geographic diversity, that there's resource concern diversity, that there's partner diversity, and we're able to do all those things by taking a national view of all the state evaluations and proposal rankings. And then we basically put it all into a big puzzle and send it up to NRCS leadership, and the final projects are selected by the NRCS chief. Just want to mention really fast the structure that through which we manage these new RCPP projects after the 2018 Farm Bill. If you're selected for an award, the first thing you'll do is sign something up here in the blue box. We call it a partnership agreement. And there's actually no funds that are obligated through that partnership agreement. It basically lays out the relationship between NRCS and the lead partner, and also talks about the project deliverables and outcomes. But we do this to maintain a whole lot of flexibility in how we manage these projects, both the technical and financial assistance. So you'll see we have this kind of bespoke financial vehicle that we call supplemental agreements, through which we can transmit technical assistance or entity-held easements or funding for public works structures. And then we have producer contracts down below. All these are the funding vehicles through which we can fund activities in an RCPP project. If an entity does receive a tentative award when we announce these, and that's scheduled for March of 2021, it's all tentative until we enter into this negotiation process. You know, everything that you submit into that proposal we accept as a proposal, but then we need to negotiate the details, including the overall project funding award. Sometimes we ask to reduce a proposed amount from, let's say, $8 million to $6 million for various reasons. The details of the financial assistance and the technical assistance, the details of the practices that you want to put on the ground or have the producers put on the ground, the eligible partner contributions. We look very carefully at the proposal and all that you are proposing before we enter into the actual agreement. The negotiations cannot change the lead partner or the project geographic area or resource concerns. Those things are locked in, so just make sure, you know, that when you're making these proposals that the right partner is the lead partner, that you're doing it in the area you want to do it in, and that you're addressing the resource concerns you want to address. I mentioned earlier the first thing that a lead partner is going to sign is a partnership agreement, and that lays out the deliverables, the outcomes approach, the contributions, et cetera. And then, you know, if there's enhancement CA involved, we would subsequently obligate that through a supplemental agreement, and then the partner can start charging NRCS for things like project management, producer outreach, and those sorts of activities. We're just about done here. Looks like we'll have about 15 minutes for questions, which certainly isn't enough time, but again, we'll take all your questions and put them into an FAQ document that we'll post just as soon as we can. So a little bit about how to apply. The very first thing that you should do is contact the state RCPP coordinator in the state or states in which you are hoping to do this work to discuss your project proposal. Again, all these proposals are evaluated at the state level. It's really critical that you get buy-in from your state RCPP coordinator, if not the state conservationist. They can help you understand, from an NRCS perspective, how best you might think about carrying out your project there at the state level. So I would do that early and often. I would encourage you to review the RCPP Partners Proposal Guide that we have on the How to Apply webpage. I think we pulled down the template this time because the portal is open. But that proposal guide is key to help you navigate the portal. And again, we have a webinar coming up on September 10th as well. I mentioned earlier the level 2 e-authentication permissions. If you haven't received those before, please apply early. To get those, it might take a little bit of time to be able to get into the portal. And then, of course, you're going to submit your proposal through the RCPP portal. My last slide here just shows the timeline that we're on here. We did release a funding announcement back on August 6th. Next month, as I mentioned, we're going to announce the FY20 Alternative Funding Arrangements Awards. This proposal period closes on November 4th. The next AFA funding announcement we have scheduled to be released in December of 2020, and that's the FY21 funding announcement for the AFAs. Again, that's a separate competition. The final rule I mentioned, we're hoping to release by the end of this calendar year, and then we have scheduled for March 2021 the announcement of the awards associated with this funding announcement. Okay, we have two key contacts. Again, the state coordinators. We have a list in the funding announcement and also on the How to Apply page. And then we have NRCS National RCPP staff that you can reach through this rcpp@usda.gov inbox, but I'd really recommend folks first touch base with their state RCPP coordinator or coordinators. Okay, I'm going to stop there. We've got about, again, 15 minutes for Q&A. My colleague, Russell Ames, is going to moderate the Q&A for us. So, Russell, I'll just turn it over to you for the first question.
Thank you, Car. Just to let folks know, we received over 50 questions, so we won't be able to get through them all, but we will include an FAQ on the website afterwards. And if there are any project-specific questions, we really encourage you to send those to your state coordinator because we will not have time to go over them all today. I will take the first question myself. Will the slides and recording be available after the webinar? The answer is yes. We'll post them on the RCPP website. It may take us up to a week, but we will get them there on the How to Apply page. For the second question, Kari, for public works projects, is it possible to submit an application without a USDA-approved watershed plan?
That's a great question. So watershed projects, again, we are running these through RCPP and not PL 566. However, this is a tricky question and it may be a longer discussion. Because we're building structures, and those structures often are protecting human life and property, we want to ensure that those structures are being built to the highest standards. And so if you're looking to submit a watershed plan that is not USDA approved, you're going to have to give us a very good reason for why we should do that. And we will look askance until we see a very good reason for why we should enter into a project that includes a watershed structure with a plan that has not met USDA standards. So I would just tread carefully if you're walking down that road. Russell, next question.
Here's a question that could take a whole nother webinar on its own, but let me know if you'd like to comment on at all. What are the reasons for applying for RCPP Classic versus an alternative funding arrangement?
Wow, Russell's throwing me all the hard balls up front. So it's a great question. So AFA projects, we anticipate are going to be attractive to a smaller subset of entities than RCPP Classic, because AFA projects effectively have to entirely be run by a partner. So all the financial assistance has to be transmitted from a lead partner or a partner to a producer or landowner. So there's not going to be RCPP contracts between NRCS and the producer. It's going to be money has to go from a partner to a producer, so you have to have some mechanism to do that. You also have to be responsible for all the technical assistance, whether it's the lead partner or a third party or some other partner. They're going to be doing all the technical assistance. So again, it's a smaller subset of entities that have the ability to do that. However, there are entities for which this is very attractive. They don't necessarily have to rely on NRCS ranking calendars and cycles. And if they have the technical assistance capabilities and the financial capabilities to do all this, then it might be very attractive. There's also flexibility to do things that we don't have the authority to do under RCPP Classic, like pay for performance activities. Right now, through RCPP Classic, we're basically, for land management, paying for practices installed. You can do pay for performance under an AFA project. And so there's a different level of innovation in AFA projects, generally speaking, and a different level of responsibility on the part of the lead partner. So we'll just leave it there for now, Russell.
Perfect. I think someone misheard you and thought that we give priority to multi-state over single state. So we had a question on that and another that mentioned our project selected for a single state.
Yes, we do not give any priority to multi-state or single state projects. We accept applications or proposals for both single state and multi-state projects. My point in that slide was to say we do give priority to multi-state projects that are proposing activities in a smaller number of states versus a larger number of states. So we know, again, from history that projects where there's 8 or 10 states involved get very unwieldy. If it's 2 or 3 states, well, that's going to be a lot more appealing to us.
Thank you, Kari. Next question. If a county is partially within a CCA, can that county be included in a CCA project?
Yes. As long as the boundary of the CCA crosses through a county, then we consider that within the CCA.
Next question is, partners seem to be defined as entities that are providing cash or in-kind contributions. If a project has a diverse set of partners that are not providing any contributions, how will that affect ranking?
Again, we ask for the list of contributing partners. It's really critical that we understand who is supporting these projects financially and who's providing those partner contributions that are really what we follow in these projects. However, if there's partnerships that have a broader set of partners that are not providing financial contributions, we certainly welcome you to list those and explain who those folks are in your proposal. There's a place that talks about the partnership, one of the questions. Folks are happy to or welcome to explain the broader partnership there. But of course, we're going to pay the most attention to those contributing partners because, again, that one-to-one ratio is really critical for us.
Perfect. Next question is a little tricky, but which of the two funding pools will be more competitive or receive more applications?
So I'll give you the answer from a historical basis. Because the CCAs have some geographic focus to it, and because they're also limited to the priority resource concerns for those CCAs, the CCA pool is generally sees fewer proposals and a little less competition. You're not going to be going up against proposals from Hawaii and Puerto Rico or any of the other states that don't touch CCAs, or projects in states that don't address the CCA's priority resource concerns. So just by doing the math there, CCAs generally have a little bit less competition. So if you're in a state or if you're in a CCA, just think carefully. If you're working on a project that touches one of those priority resource concerns, you might want to consider applying for the CCA pool. Of course, if I say that now, everybody's going to rush into the CCAs. But historically speaking, the CCAs have seen a little less competition than on the state multi-state side. Next question.
If November might be too soon to apply for a project, what will the next opportunity for funding be?
Man, we're kind of working on a day-to-day basis here, but it's a good question. As you may have noted, this is the FY20 and FY21 funding announcement. So this the next fiscal year, which is fiscal year 21, starts October 1st. And so you will not see another funding announcement from us potentially until the very end of this next fiscal year. So think late next summer or maybe even into the fall. We just need to figure out what works best. So it'll be basically a year from now before we will be coming out with, at the very earliest, before we come out with the next RCPP Classic funding announcement.
Thank you, Kari. Next question is, NFO says in rare circumstances that the 30% TA cap may be exceeded or funds could be shifted from ETA to ITA, enhance the TA to implementation TA. Could you give some examples of what would be a good justification for this?
That's a great question. We haven't seen one yet. For the 48 projects that we announced in April, nobody was requesting or was granted a higher than 30% TA rate. More common are folks requesting higher FA rates. So they're thinking we don't need as much technical assistance funding and we want to put more conservation on the ground. Those are the types of variances we'll be more likely to grant. There's got to be a really good reason to spend more than 30% on technical assistance for these projects, and I wish I could give you one, but we haven't seen one yet.
Here's an easy one. Can a contributing partner be another federal agency or entity?
Again, I kind of blew through it, but as long as it's not a USDA agency, so it's got to be a non-USDA agency, and then the federal funding has to be spent, again, supporting the project objective in the same geographic area as the project, on the same natural resource concerns, and spent within the lifespan of the project, then yes, there is potential for those federal dollars to count as project contribution.
Thank you, Kari. Next question might be a great Rebecca question, though you can cover it too if you want, Kari. In the application portal, the lead partner is required to have Eauthentication in order to access the portal. Is this required of all partners or only the lead partner?
I'd be happy to give my voice a rest. Rebecca, do you want to chime in? Possible that Rebecca went out for a snack. So I will say that the lead partner is the entity that is submitting the proposal, and the lead partner has to have EAuth permission to be able to get into the portal.
And I would just add that we expect the lead partner to fill out the application. We wouldn't expect all of the contributing partners to need to get access to contribute their part, but the lead partner should be able to enter their information for them.
Correct.
Next question is, what is the definition of associated lands? For example, if there's a creek that has agriculture on one side and non-agriculture on the other, but both sides of the creek need to be treated to address the resource concern.
Boy, I don't have it at the tip of my tongue, but we do have the definition for associated lands, which comes from our National Planning Handbook at NRCS. It is in the funding announcement under the land eligibility section. Please take a close look at that, and if you have questions, just let us know over email.
Next question is, can RCPP projects include research as a component of the project? For example, research to see what practices are most effective in a specific region.
So NRCS funding can't really be used, RCPP funding for research activities under an RCPP project, potentially under enhancement TA, but that funding is very limited. And so if there's going to be research activities associated with an RCPP project, which we can encourage, it's got to be paid for through and supported through partner contributions. Russell, it looks like we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. Let's see what we got.
Sure. Next question is, can you elaborate on interim practice standards? Does that imply some innovation to a standard conservation practice?
Yeah, an interim practice standard is generally first established at a state level. If we don't have a practice standard that covers the activities that a partner or a producer wants to do, they could potentially request that we establish an interim practice standard. There is language in the funding announcement about this. Just know that it can take some time and a good bit of scientific evidence and research potentially to establish an interim practice standard. So do not think that this is something that you can come in and say, hey, we want to do X, Y, and Z under an interim practice standard, and we're going to approve it tomorrow. That's just not the way it works in NRCS in general. There's a process to approve interim practice standards. So just be wary if you're thinking that this is something you want to do as part of your project. It takes some time, and you're going to want to take that time into consideration when you're thinking about your proposal. So, Russell, let's do one more quick one.
Perfect. I think this is a great question to end up on. For the NRCS goal of contributions being equal to or greater than NRCS funding, is this for the FA only, or is it against the entire project cost, including NRCS TA?
It's against the entire project cost. So if a lead partner is requesting an $8 million NRCS investment, the partner contributions, our goal is to have them be at least $8 million. So with that, I know there's a lot of questions we didn't get to. Again, we're going to compile them into an FAQ document and post that on the RCPP How to Apply page just as soon as we can. I want to thank our host. I want to thank Russell for quickly juggling all of those questions that were coming in. And I want to thank you all for participating today. I know there's a lot of information here. Encourage you to rewatch this or send this to partners that are interested. And we look forward to seeing your proposals in November. Again, please touch base with your state coordinators just as soon as you can to discuss your ideas. And we'll talk to you real soon. Thanks very much. I'll turn it back over to our host.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining today's conference, and thank you for using Event Services. Your conference is now ended, and you may disconnect.